Good day and best greetings to Seoul. 안녕하십니까? 반갑습니다. In the following, I will briefly introduce myself and describe what I have been doing over the last 20 years. My name is Chung, and I have been living in Germany for more than 40 years. I am a licensed German attorney and have originally worked as an international business lawyer in a big law firm. When I started studying law in 1984, the first personal computer came into the market. The IBM PC 8086 was my first computer. Already at this time, I knew that law was not suitable to be stored in human heads. So I developed a computer program that could be used to solve legal cases. Legal thinking is artificial. That's why you have probably noticed that you cannot have a normal chat with a lawyer. I believe that the use of artificial intelligence is well suited in the field of law. In 2000, I founded the company Janolaw. Jano is composed of Ja meaning yes, no, and law. Janolaw means yes, no law. I was of the opinion that a lot of legal work can be done by computer and at much higher quality than many lawyers would be willing to admit. The first reaction to our market presence were mixed from is that useful to this must be prohibited. After all, we are talking about 2001, not 2021. Even today, the hallmark of the public opinion is legal tech. Is that any good? Will that not kill many valuable lawyers' jobs? What is legal tech? Legal tech is an artificial word that originated from the combination of the word legal and technology. Simply understood, legal activity with the help of technology. Under those conditions, using the computer to write a legal letter was already legal tech. Of course, today our interpretation of the word is a lot more extensive than that. Today, legal tech encompasses much more. It stands for legal service that are only possible because of the new technology. Cars have always been packed with electronics, but when self-driving cars come into the picture, we all know that these are on a complete different level. They are the real tech cars. And it is no different with the area of legal tech. Legal services that are previously unimaginable because lawyers simply could not provide them are now becoming possible. Think about the right management of digital content when you watch a pay movie on YouTube. The system, first of all, understands how long you can watch this film, which then at the same time triggers a chain of legal actions resulting in the rights of holders, including the film producer, channel owner, advertising partner, etc., to receive their share of your payment. Basically, crypto assets are nothing more than the trading and administrating of digital rights as a legal service. All of these become possible thanks to the technology progress, especially in data and digital technology. Over the past 20 years, Janolaw has seen itself as a technological laboratory in the field of legal tech. Our mission statement was and is to use modern technology to create new values, means, and ways in order to establish justice and human dignity in the world. We explored new technologies and experimented whether and how the use of these technologies in the legal field is received by people. We have developed, among others, automated advisory systems that were used in the insurance sector, data protection systems, and living will systems that could contact the hospital in critical situations. We therefore know now from our own experience what does and does not function in legal tech, what is and is not needed and wanted by the people. In my presentation, I would like to try to convince you that legal tech is useful and in our digitalized world essential. Legal tech belongs to the world of e-commerce like a battery to an electric car. Legal tech is a vital part of e-commerce. To begin with, I would like to invite you to think about what a market is. A market is a place where goods change hands. Here buyers and sellers come together to meet their respective needs. This concept of a market has been valid since mankind has existed. And this also applies to online marketplaces. Now, a market is not an abstract and value-neutral entity. Rulership and the markets have always been linked together. The ruler was the organizer and protector of the market because the market was one of their main sources of income for them. Let's take, for example, the war between the Romans and the Huns under Attila in 447 AD, which ended with the Peace of Anatolius Treaty. The most important part of that treaty was the right of the Huns to organize a market day once a month in the Roman territory. This market became the trading ground for Huns, Romans, and traders from neighboring nations. The market may have been profitable for all, but without doubt, the one who profited most were the Hunnic rulers, since they collected entry fees from all market participants. Today, a substantial portion of trade takes place online, and this trade knows no borders. 40% of the top 10 sellers on European Amazon markets are Chinese sellers. I personally, as an avid Amazon user, absolutely support this. However, their competitors are complaining massively that the Chinese have an advantage because they do not comply with the existing laws and regulations. For example, European sellers of electrical goods must pay the cost of disposing electrical waste in advance. Chinese and other non-European sellers don't. It is immediately obvious to anyone who has dealt with market mechanism that this situation cannot be upheld in the long run. Two things are needed for a market to function in the long term: market order and market police. It must be clear to every participant from the outset how to behave in the market, that you can't sell fake goods, for example, or that you have to pay in a certain currency to buy a good. Your competitors isn't your greatest enemy. Anarchy is the greatest enemy of the market. Just ask a seller on a market. He prefers to pay protection money to gangsters so that no beggars roam around on the marketplace. These two elements are only partially present in online markets today. This is also the greatest obstacle for the future growth of e-commerce, nationally and internationally. The forthcoming European Digital Services Act should be understood with this background in mind. The EU wants to introduce a market regime that all participants must adhere to, and the organizers of online markets must ensure that this is enforced. The EU regulation is expected to be adopted in June 2022. The Korean government has also proposed a similar law, 전자상거래법, which is expected to come into force in April 2022. The aim of these new legislative initiatives is the creation of a binding market regulation and the introduction of the market police in online markets. When enacted, the market platform must ensure the legal conformity not only of their own business, but also that of their sellers. Otherwise, they will face severe fines up to 10% of their annual turnover, or even the shutdown of the platform. I think we can all agree that that's good news. But the problem lies in the execution. Can the platforms comply with these new regulations? And what is the cost of the compliance to these new rules? I want to illustrate this problem with an example, the right of revocation of an online purchase. According to the currently valid European regulation, the seller must grant the buyer the right to withdraw from the contract in internet trading. Thus, the buyer can cancel the transaction within 14 days. And the seller must correctly inform his customers about their right of revocation by displaying it on his shop site. This sounds like a pretty simple job. The reality, however, proves otherwise. As it is often the case, the devil is in the details. There are 4 different types of revocation, depending on how the goods are being delivered to the customer. In one delivery, partial delivery, regular delivery on a regular basis over a fixed period of time, in several partial shipment or pieces. And what happens if the buyer declares the revocation? There are no fewer than 12 options from which the seller may choose. The seller can pick up the good from the buyer's home. He can ask the buyer to send it to him. He can ask the buyer to pay the cost of transport and etc. There are 12 options in this regard, but the problem is only that the seller must correctly publish his decision on his website or shop site. Normally, a shop operator cannot do that by himself. He needs a lawyer who supports him formulating his revocation policy. And the revocation policy must be published in the language of the buyer. Now put yourself in the shoes of a Chinese seller who sells on 5 major Amazon marketplaces in Europe: Amazon Germany, Amazon France, Amazon UK, Amazon Spain, Amazon Italy. He would have to determine his return policy for these 5 countries and publish it in his shop in 5 languages. Unless the shop owner is a genius multilingual lawyer, he can't do that. That's why he won't publish anything at all. Under the new regulation, Amazon cannot remain inactive as it is today. According to the new Korean and EU legislation, the store operator is responsible for ensuring that all his sellers provide their customers with a correct revocation policy and that they keep their own promises. The platform operator must therefore take on the role of the market police. But how can Amazon accomplish this? According to its own information, Amazon has over 2 million sellers on its marketplaces. The majority of Chinese traders, also 20,000 Korean sellers in Europe, have no revocation policy correctly published. In the future, Amazon would have to block these sellers. In Korea, Section 28 of the Digital Services Act explicitly states that the platform operator must actively participate in dispute between the seller and the buyer. Today, we generally see this sentence in all platforms. We are only an intermediary. We do not assume any responsibility for transactions between sellers and buyers. That will no longer work in the future. How is a large platform like Coupang, Naver, Gmarket, etc. supposed to solve this problem? By employing thousands of lawyers? That would damage their business model. This is where LegalTech comes into play. Platform operators must first of all offer technological solutions to their customers so that they may generate legally correct text such as a revocation policy. Furthermore, the legal text must be updated continuously in accordance with the applicable law and case law. And lastly, the applicable legal text must be machine readable and interpretable. In the event of a dispute, the machine must be able to decide by using the applicable policy of the seller. In our example, the machine must know which revocation rule is relevant for the online shop involved and solve the problem by using this term. Janolaw has implemented this solution in 2016 and has since then installed it on over 20,000 online shops. In step 1, we enable the vendors of e-commerce transactions to create all rules which they need and which are valid in the jurisdiction involved at their general terms and conditions, revocation policy, etc. in 5 languages. In step 2, we let the artificial intelligence use these rules to solve all disputes arising from these transactions. We currently provide legal services for Korean sellers on European Amazon and eBay in English, German, and Korean. I'll demonstrate how a Korean seller would legally produce a valid revocation policy in English, German, and Korean, which he can display on his Amazon shop in a do-it-self manner. You create your revocation policy by answering the question the system asks you. First question would be, are you using a fax machine? 팩스기를 사용하십니까? And you answer it with yes. The next question is, what kind of delivery you are performing? If you are if you deliver in one delivery, then you check it here, or separate delivery, or uh, periodical delivery, or possible. And the system explains you what all these options mean. So you choose one-time delivery, then you fill in all your details, and then comes questions pertaining to the return of the purchase good. Do you want to purchase it to send it back? And if you say yes, then the next question is, do you want the good to be sent to a warehouse? And if you don't possess a warehouse, you say no. And then the next question is, 반송 비용을 부담하시겠습니까? Do you want take over the cost of the return? And if you say yes, and then the question is whether you want rule alternative, a second revocation policy. If you say no, and then the next question is, do you want to include your revocation policy into the general terms and conditions? And if you say no, then the question goes on. There will be several more questions. Meanwhile, you see on the right side that the revocation policy is being created in Korean, in English, and in German. So it reads like, right of revocation, you have the right to revoke this contract within 14 days without giving reason. And then all the information needed to be displayed on the web shop or on the marketplace is being formulated. So you will be sent these documents in Korean, German, and English. And for German customer, you must display the German version. For Korean customers, the Korean version, and English for English customers. If you ask a lawyer to provide you with legal text you need to place on your Amazon shop, he will ask you to pay 5,000 euros. He will ask you to pay additional 2,000 euros if you want to have some changes on the document because you changed your policy. And if you haven't dispute with the customer and you ask your lawyer for advice, he'll ask you to pay 500 euros. In total, he will charge you with 7,500 euros per year. Janolaw provides these legal services for only 180 euros per year. And Janolaw settles all disputes of the seller with his customers free of charge. Janolaw's cost is only therefore 3% of the lawyer's cost in the old economy. This is disruptive. The only reason this is possible for us is because we use software to manage all of our customers' legal texts. If a change in the legislation happens, all text influenced by the change are modified automatically. Janolaw is active on over 10 major European platforms: Amazon, eBay, Metro, Kauflauf, Idealo, Shopware, Magento, DHL, etc. We believe that our service has significantly increased customers' trust and confidence in the online shops. This made our customers happy. This is clearly proven by market researchers. Janolaw has been awarded Germany's best product by the renowned German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung for 2 years in a row, 2020 and 2021. Not even BMW or Mercedes-Benz ever have achieved that. Summing up the presentation, there is growing awareness that online markets and their dominant players must be placed under supervision. One immediately thinks of harsh restrictions, prohibitions, and penalties, and many dominant players like Amazon, Google, Facebook, and the likes are resisting against them. But is it not in the very interest of them that their markets have an order? It should therefore not be seen as a restriction and obstacle for their growth, but much more as an opportunity for further development. It will become a crucial step for them to continue their growth that they have achieved over the last 10 years or the next decade. It of course entails a heavy burden for the platform operators, since they are not only expected to be mere organizers of the market, but also take on the role of a market police. But the burden is justified. Seeing the amount of profit they make, reinvesting it into the business for the good of both the users and the platform itself can't harm. Without use of LegalTech, the burden of cost will be so high that operating an online marketplace will not be profitable anymore, at least on an international scale. That is why LegalTech is so important for future e-commerce. Amazon and Co. have built many hardware infrastructure like warehouses and pickup stations in the past. Now they need to build soft infrastructure, mainly LegalTech services. Thank you very much for your attention. I would be very happy to connect with you if you have any questions or new ideas pertaining to LegalTech. 감사합니다.